On April 6, 1895, Oscar Wilde was arrested for the heinous crime of being a homosexual. How did this come about and why? For this episode of In Queer News, we will be looking into this case and reading a news article about it. Hello, beautiful historians. Our story for today started in 1895 when Oscar Wilde began dating Lord Alfred Douglas, the son of the Marquis of Queensberry. The Marquis did not approve of this relationship, and by April of 1894 was making things very hard for the couple. He disowned his son and publicly accused Wilde of being a sodomite. Sodomy was a crime in England, and the options, as far as Wilde was concerned, were to leave England or stay and fight. Douglas encouraged him to stay and fight he did. Sorry I've been absent for a while, guys. I'm in the process of selling this house, and that has been taking up a lot of my time. After I move and set up my new studio, I hope to have a better schedule. But I'd rather have a few good videos than a bunch of poorly done ones. So I will not be promising a particular schedule. When I have a good video finished, I will publish it, and I hope to improve my recording, writing, and research quality with each video because you guys deserve the best. Now, let's get on with the Wilde case. Oscar Wilde was an author and playwright. He was best known for his novel, The Pictures of Dorian Gray, and his plays, Lady Windermere's Fan, and The Importance of Being Earnest. He was also known for his flamboyance, often wearing extravagant clothing that made him stand out in a crowd. For today's story, we will be looking at his very public court cases that ended with him spending 2 years hard labor in prison. Wilde took Lord Queensberry to court for libel, denying that there was any truth to his allegations that Wilde was a sodomite. There was truth, and Queensberry and his team provided plenty of evidence. At 3:30 on the final day of the trial, Scotland Yard asked the judge to issue a warrant for Oscar Wilde's arrest. The judge, after asking what time the final train left for Dover, adjourned to consider the warrant. The case was lost, but Wilde still had some time. He sat in his room dithering as to if he should jump on that final train or not. After the train had left, he is said to have said, "The train has gone, it is too late." The warrant was issued shortly after that, and Wilde was arrested. This trial was hung, meaning the jury could not decide if he was guilty or not. There was another trial, and he was convicted and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Today's article is from the day that he lost the libel suit against Queensberry and was arrested for committing acts of gross indecency. In this article, you will hear evidence that Wilde was a homosexual. He was. And that he groomed unemployed young men. Again, he did. Wilde was a very complicated man who enjoyed the company of younger men, around 20 years old. He was 41 at the time of this suit. These were not boys, but they were much younger than him, and they were in a financial situation that made it hard for them to say no. Some may still call what Wilde did distasteful. The men were adults and said yes. However, did they really have the ability to say no? I'll let you decide how bad the crime was. Were these young men willing, or did he take advantage of their situation? Keep in mind that this is just one article in a large set of documents. For a full opinion on this, we would need to dig into a much larger set of documents, including the trial documents. Let me know in the comments if you would like me to do a deep dive into this case. Wilde chose to start the first libel suit, which opened him up for Queensberry and his team to prove that the accusations of posing as a sodomite were valid. He also could have moved to France before his own trial. France was much more tolerant at this time, but he dithered until the train had gone, and it was too late for him to run. After his release from prison, he did choose to move to France, where he lived for the remainder of his life. I will read a censored line in today's news article, posing as beep. The censored word does not need to be censored for modern readers, but I will still read it as it was printed. You can hear the censored beep as sodomite. So the full accusation is posing as sodomite. This is a long one, and is actually multiple related articles published together. These articles are the Wilde case about the completion of the libel trial where Wilde had sued Queensberry for libel and lost. Lord Queensberry's warning to Wilde, where Queensberry threatens to shoot Wilde. Startling sequel to the libel action, where Wilde is arrested. Precaution to prevent escape, where Scotland Yard says they tried to keep him from escaping. Reported letter of explanation from Wilde, where Wilde explains that he could have won if he had put Lord Douglas on the stand, but did not for Douglas's own sake. And the Chameleon, where the publishers of one of Wilde's works distance themselves from the stink. Now sit back and enjoy listening to this piece of history as printed in the Sheffield and Rotterdam Independent on Saturday, April 6, 1895.
Page 6. The Wilde case. Sensational collapse. Withdrawal of Sir E. Clarke. Verdict of the Marquis of Queensberry. The libel, true in substance and in fact. Thrilling scene in court. The hearing of the charge against the Marquis of Queensberry of criminally libeling Mr. Oscar Wilde was resumed yesterday morning at the Central Criminal Court, before Mr. Justice N. Collins. The defense was a justification of the libel. The counsel for the prosecution were Sir E. Clarke, Q.C., Mr. C. Matthews, and Mr. Travers Humphreys. Mr. Carson, Q.C., Mr. C. F. Gill, Q.C., and Mr. A. Gill appeared for Lord Queensberry, while Mr. Beasley, Q.C., and Mr. Monckton watched the case for Lord Douglas of Hawick, the eldest son of the Marquis. The public galleries were again crowded, the greatest interest being shown in the proceedings. His lordship took his seat at 10:30. Mr. Oscar Wilde was not present when Carson rose to resume his speech for the defense. Mr. Carson said that at the adjournment on Thursday he had dealt as fully as he intended to deal with the question of Wilde's connection with the literature that had been produced in the case, and also with the 2 letters that had been read, and he almost hoped that he had sufficiently demonstrated upon these matters, which were not really in dispute, that Lord Queensberry was absolutely justified in bringing to a climax, in the way that he did, the question of the connection between Mr. Oscar Wilde and his son. He had, unfortunately, a more powerful part of the case now to approach. It would be his painful duty to bring before the jury those young men, one after another, to tell their tale. It was, of course, even for an advocate, a distasteful task. But let those who were inclined to condemn these men for allowing themselves to be dominated, misled, and corrupted by Oscar Wilde, remember the relative position of the 2 parties, and that they were men more sinned against than sinning. He was not going in great detail to criticize the evidence of Wilde with regard to the several transactions as to which he cross-examined him. There was a general observation applicable to all the cases. There was a startling similarity between each of them, on Wilde's own admission, which must lead the jury to draw the most painful conclusions. There was the fact that in not one of these cases were the parties upon an equality with Wilde in any way. They were not educated parties, such as he would naturally associate with. They were not his equal in years, and there was a curious similarity between the ages of each of them. Mr. Wilde said that there was something beautiful and charming about youth that led him to adopt the course he did. But was he unable to find more suitable companions who were at the same time young among the youths of his own age? The thing was absurd. His excuse in the box was only a travesty of what was the reality of the matter. Who were these young men? They were out of employment, and of the antecedents Wilde professed to know nothing. All of them were from 18 to 20 years of age or thereabouts, and in the matter of their introduction to Wilde and his subsequent treatment of them, all were in the same category, leading to the same conclusion, that there was something unnatural in what might not ordinarily be expected in the relations between them. Parker was a gentleman's service out of employment. He and his brother were in the restaurant in Piccadilly and were met by Taylor, and when a day or two later Wilde gave Taylor a dinner on his birthday, telling him to bring any friends he liked, what an idea he must have had of Wilde's taste when he brought a groom and a valet. If that one fact was true and the main features had been admitted by Wilde, why did Taylor speak to these young men at all, and why did he bring them to dine with Wilde? There could be no explanation of these matters but the one that Taylor was the procurer for Wilde. They would hear from Parker when he came to tell his unfortunate story, that he was poor, out of place, and tell a victim to Wilde. He would tell them that on the first evening they met, Wilde addressed him, the valet, as Charlie, and that he addressed this distinguished dramatist, whose name was being spoken everywhere in London, as the author of a most successful play, as Oscar. He did not wish to say anything about Wilde's theories of putting an end to social distinctions. It might be a very noble and generous instinct in some people to wish to level down all social barriers, but one thing that was plain in this case was that Wilde's conduct was not regulated by any very generous instincts towards these young men. If he wanted to assist Parker, was it of benefit for a man in Wilde's position in society and literature to take him to a magnificent dinner and prime him with the best champagne? All the ridiculous expenses of Wilde would not bear a moment's examination. Wilde pretended that the whole of these dinners and lunches were more generous actions on his part. He gave no explanation of why he had that suite of rooms at the Savoy Hotel. It was a large hotel, and Wilde had no difficulty in taking Parker into his rooms, where he treated him with whiskies and sodas, and some of that iced champagne which his doctor forbade Wilde to have, and so worked up to what followed. There had been no open scandal at the Savoy Hotel, but a man could not live that kind of life without gossip going abroad, and reports being circulated in the circles in which he mixed. After they heard the evidence from the Savoy Hotel, they would wonder, not that the gossip reached Lord Queensberry's ears, but that the man Wilde had been tolerated for years in society as he had. He referred to the youth Parker, who was coming there with the greatest reluctance, and was now earning for himself a good character in the country, and Wilde's dealings with the boy Conway. Hello, historians. So I'm sitting in bed here and doing some editing. I was thinking about how the author, the journalist here, put everything together in such a way that it really showed as much contempt for Oscar Wilde as possible. And it really brings about how We need to, when we're looking at something like this, we need to look at things from multiple perspectives. We need to have a lot of different pieces of information and not just one journalist's very biased feelings about what's going on. Also, as I'm reading through this, there's no quotes, so I'm unclear as to which of this commentary is Mr. Carson saying things and which of this commentary is the journalist saying things, which very well could be Mr. Carson's contempt for Oscar Wilde. We know that Mr. Carson had a lot of contempt for Oscar Wilde, and they had had this conflict for a long time before, even before the trial happened. Carson and Oscar Wilde were not exactly good friends. They were contemptuous towards each other. I believe that's part of why Carson took on this case, is because he's like, woohoo, I get to go after Oscar Wilde. Here's one particular quote from the article that I find very telling. Mr. Wilde said that there was something beautiful and charming about youth that led him to adopt the course he did, but was he unable to find more suitable companions who were at the same time young among the youth of his own class? Isn't that what this whole trial is about? Is because he did find somebody that was young among the youth of his own class? Lord Alfred Bosie Douglas was a youth who is the man that Oscar is accused of being a sodomite with, who is the son of Lord Queensberry, the one that had supposedly libeled Oscar Wilde. But this case all stems from Wilde dating a youth among his own class. So if he hadn't dated a youth among his own class, none of this would have mattered. Nobody would have cared, really. That comes out a little bit later here when they talk about how he had been taking these young men to the Savoy Hotel for a long time and nobody ever said anything. It's only because he's dating somebody of his own class that it becomes a problem.
If you've made it this far, I'd like to encourage you to just tap that thumbs up. And if you would like more historical queer content, I'd love for you to subscribe.
The last scene and verdict. He was proceeding when Sir E. Clarke spoke to him, and they consulted for a moment. Sir Edward Clarke then said, "Will your lordship allow me to interpose and make a statement?" which is, of course, made under a feeling of very grave responsibility. My learned friend, Mr. Carson, on Thursday addressed the jury upon the question of the literature involved in this case, and upon the inference to be drawn from admissions made with regard to the letters read on Thursday. My learned friend began his address by saying that he hoped the need of having the jury deal with these details could be avoided. I think it must have been present to your mind that the representatives of Mr. Oscar Wilde have before them in this case a very terrible anxiety. They could not conceal from themselves that inferences which might be drawn might not improperly induce the jury to say that when Lord Queensberry used the words posing as a beep, he was using words for which there was a sufficient justification for a father to use them. That, in our view, might not be an improbable result of that part of the case. I and my learned friends who were with me had to look forward to this, that a verdict given in favor of the defendant upon that point might be regarded as a finding with regard to all parts of the case. The position we stood in was that, in view of the findings of a verdict, we would be going through long evidence dealing with matters of a most appalling character. In these circumstances, I hope your lordship will think I am taking the right course of action, having regard to what has been already said in respect of the literature and of the letters. I feel that I could not resist a verdict of not guilty in this case. Not guilty, that is, having reference to the words posing as beep. In these circumstances, I hope your lordship will think that I am not going beyond the bounds of duty, and that I am doing something to save and prevent what would be a most terrible task, however it might close. If I now interpose to say that on behalf of Mr. Oscar Wilde, I would ask to withdraw from the prosecution. If your lordship does not think that at this time of the case and after that has taken place I ought to be allowed to do this, I am prepared to submit to a verdict of not guilty, having reference, if to any part of the particulars, to that part of the particulars which is connected to the publication of Dorian Gray and with the publication of the Chameleon. I trust, my lord, that that may make an end of this case. Mr. Carson, I do not know that I have any right whatever to interfere in any way in the application my learned friend has made. I can only say, as far as Lord Queensberry is concerned, that if there is a plea of not guilty, a plea which involves that he has succeeded in his complete justification, I am quite satisfied. Of course, my learned friend would admit that we must succeed in that plea in the matter in which he has said, and that being so, it will rest entirely with your lordship as to whether the course suggested by my learned friend ought to be taken. His lordship. Inasmuch as the prosecutor in this case is prepared to acquiesce in a verdict of not guilty against the accused, I do not think it any part of the function of the judge or the jury to insist on going into details which can have no bearing on the matter which is already concluded by the assent of the prosecutor. But as for putting any limitation on the verdict, the justification is one which is a justification of the charge, which is of posing as beep. If that is justified, it is justified, and if it is not, it is not, and the verdict of the jury upon it must be guilty or not guilty. As I understand, the prosecutor will assent to a verdict of not guilty. There can be no terms, there can be no limitation of the verdict, which must be guilty or not guilty. Of course, the jury will return a verdict of not guilty. Mr. Carson, the verdict will be that complete justification is proved and that the publication was for the public benefit. His lordship, the verdict will be not guilty, but it is arrived at by the process of course. I shall have to tell the jury that the justification was proved, and that it was true in substance and in fact that the prosecutor had posed as beep. And I shall also have to tell them that they will have to find that the statement was published in such a manner as to be for the public benefit. If they find on these 2 points, the verdict will be not guilty. A few seconds later, his lordship, turning to the jury, said, "Your verdict will be not guilty, but there are other matters which have to be determined with reference to the specific findings of complete justification, and, as I told you, that involves the statement as true in fact and that the publication is for the public benefit. These are the facts on which you will have to find, and if you find them in favor of the defendant, your verdict will be not guilty. You will have to say whether you find complete justification has been proved or no." The jury, without leaving the box, signified in a few minutes that they had arrived at their decision. The clerks of arraigns. Do you find the complete justification proved or not? The foreman of the jury. Yes. The clerk. Do you find a verdict of not guilty? The foreman. Yes. The clerk. And that is the verdict of you all. The foreman. Yes. And we also find that the publication was for the public benefit. The verdict was received with applause, and becoming known in the streets, there was a demonstration of approval on the part of a large crowd. Mr. Carson, the costs will follow. May I ask that Lord Queensberry should be discharged? His lordship. Certainly. Lord Queensberry then left the dock and came into the well of the court, where he received the congratulations of his friends. There was renewed applause on the appearance of Lord Queensberry.
Our sponsor today is me. Did you notice this cool new shirt I'm wearing? I designed it with the help of the Little Queer Historian. You can get one of your own and other queer gear from my Super Queer Gear store at superqueerhistory.com.
Lord Queensberry's warning to Wilde. Lord Queensberry states that as soon as the trial ended, he sent this message to Wilde. If the country will allow you to leave, all the better for the country. But if you take my son with you, I will follow you wherever you go and shoot you. Startling sequel to the libel case. Oscar Wilde arrested. On leaving the court, Mr. Charles Russell, Lord Queensberry's solicitor, addressed the following letter to the public prosecutor. 37 Norfolk Street, Strand. To the Honourable Hamilton Cuff, Director of Prosecutions. To the Honourable Hamilton Cuff, Director of Prosecutions. Dear Sir, in order that there may be no miscarriage of justice, I think it is my duty at once to send you a copy of all our witnesses' statements, together with a copy of the shorthand notes of the trial. Yours faithfully, Charles Russell. The Press Association says Mr. Oscar Wilde was arrested last evening and conveyed to Bow Street Police Station. The arrest was made by Inspector Richards at 6:30 at the Cadogan Hotel, Sloane Street, Chelsea, where Mr. Wilde, it appeared, drove after leaving Holborn Viaduct Hotel. Mr. Wilde's visit to the hotel was of a casual character, he being accompanied by two gentlemen. Throughout the day the accused had been closely followed by two officers, and when Inspector Richards entered the hotel and asked Mr. Wilde, it was stated that he was not staying there. This was virtually correct, but when the inspector insisted that he was in the establishment and explained the circumstances, he was conducted to a room in the establishment where Mr. Wilde was engaged with his two friends. The inspector informed him that he was a police officer and that he would arrest him, a warrant being out for his arrest. Mr. Wilde made no reply. Mr. Wilde, in the custody of two officers, was at once conducted to a cab which conveyed the party to Scotland Yard, where Inspector Brockwell was waiting with the warrant for Mr. Wilde's arrest. The formality of reading the warrant to the accused and the administration of the statutory caution having been gone through, Mr. Wilde hazarded no remark. The trio, Mr. Wilde, Inspector Richards, and Inspector Brockwell, then drove to Bow Street, where they arrived at 10 minutes past 8 o'clock in a four-wheeled cab. The accused was the first to slight from the vehicle and walk direct into the station, followed by the detectives. He was attired in a long black frock coat, dark trousers, and silk hat. His demeanor was that of a gentleman, self-confident of his own innocence of the charge alleged against him. He was at once placed in the prisoner's dock in the charge room, and while the charge was being taken, he stood with his hands in his pockets. Inspector Digby, who took the charge, read it to the prisoner and warned him that anything he might say could be used in evidence against him. Mr. Wilde maintained his reticence and indifferent air.
The Press Association understands that the charge alleged against Mr. Wilde is that of committing acts of indecency with diverse male persons. Having been searched, Mr. Wilde was removed to the cells. Shortly after Mr. Wilde's arrival at Bow Street, Mr. Rossi, a friend of the prisoner's, drove up to the station with a small Gladstone bag containing a change of clothes and other necessaries for Mr. Wilde. But after a short interview with the inspector on duty, Mr. Rossi returned to his cab, with the bag having been refused permission to leave it. Later, Lord Alfred Douglas visited Bow Street to inquire as to the possibility of the accused being bailed out, but it was explained that the prisoner had been arrested on a warrant for an alleged criminal offense, which admitted of no bail until the prisoner had appeared before the magistrate. Lord Douglas appeared much distressed when he was informed that on no consideration could the authorities entertain his application. He was respectfully informed that the prisoner had a cell to himself and had been supplied with a blanket and other requisites to make him comfortable as police regulations would allow. It would be Mr. Wilde's privilege to receive food sent him from a neighboring hotel if he so desired, pending his transference from the cell in the police station to the cells of the adjoining police court at 10 o'clock this morning. Sir John Bridge, who signed the warrant for his arrest, will investigate the charge against Mr. Wilde, which involves a penal offense. The Central News says that Oscar Wilde was arrested shortly after 7 o'clock last evening and taken to Scotland Yard. There he was formally charged with the commission of unnatural offences with the lad Woods and others. He will be charged in the ordinary courts at Bow Street Police Court this morning. The Central News adds, the warrant for the arrest of Oscar Wilde was executed by Inspector Richards of Scotland Yard, who, with Sergeant Allen, proceeded to the Cadogan Hotel, Sloane Street, shortly after 6 o'clock last evening, and arrested the prisoner. He appeared somewhat surprised when the charge was read over to him, but made no reply, and was immediately taken to New Scotland Yard and handed over to Inspector Brockwell, who held the warrants. After remaining for some time at Scotland Yard, Oscar Wilde was placed in a four-wheeled cab and conveyed to Bow Street, where he arrived at 10 minutes past 8 in custody of Inspector Brockwell and Richards. On alighting from the cab, Wilde walked up to the steps to the door of the police station briskly, with his hands in his pockets, and was once placed in the dock and charged by Inspector Digby with committing acts of gross indecency with certain male persons, to wit, one Charles Parsons and others, on a certain date and divers other dates and places. While the charge was being read, the prisoner leaned over the dock, still keeping his hands in his pocket and appearing unconcerned. The prisoner did not make any reply to the charge, and he was removed for the night to an ordinary cell. Soon after Wilde had been removed to the cells, a man drove up in a hansom cab, bearing a portmanteau containing some of the prisoner's clothes, etc. He carried the bag into the station, but the police would not permit him to leave it, and he had to carry it away again. Lord Alfred Douglas also paid a visit to Bow Street in the course of the evening. When the four-wheeler containing Wilde and the police inspectors drove up to front of Bow Street station, several newspaper reporters were waiting. But there was no excitement of any kind, and the prisoner was not recognized by anybody save the reporters. He will be brought up before the magistrate and charged today, when it is understood evidence of a formal character will be rendered. Precautions to prevent escape. Wiring last evening before the arrest, the Central News said, sensational and conflicting rumors are current in London respecting the whereabouts of Mr. Oscar Wilde and his immediate intentions. One of these was to the effect that he left Victoria Station by the boat express for Paris. The Central News is enabled to state, however, that up to 4 o'clock this afternoon, Wilde was beyond doubt still in London. After conferring briefly with his counsel, Sir Edward Clarke, at the Central Criminal Court this morning, while proceeding in company with Lord A. Douglas and 2 other gentlemen, one of whom was a lawyer, to the Holborn Viaduct Hotel, where Wilde had slept on the previous night, on account of its convenient proximity to the court. The party remained in earnest conference in a private room until 1 o'clock, when they partook of luncheon, at which much wine was drunk. At 2:15, the four men drove off in Wilde's brougham, which had been waiting outside the hotel for a considerable time. Their destination was a bank in St. James, where a large sum of money was drawn out on a check payable to self. From that point, Wilde was lost sight of. Meanwhile, an application had been made at Bow Street by, it is understood, Mr. Charles Russell, Lord Queensberry's solicitor in the case, which ended so dramatically today, and Mr. Angus Lewis of the Treasury, for a warrant for the arrest of Wilde, and the application was granted by Sir John Bridge and placed without delay in the hands of the police. A description of Wilde was afterwards issued, and his arrest is expected momentarily. The railway stations from which trains leave tonight in connection with the steamers for foreign parts are being watched by detectives, and Wilde's description has been sent by telegraph to the chiefs of police in British ports with urgent requests that he might be arrested at sight. It may be stated as the central news that the inquiries which resulted in the information upon which Mr. Carson's masterly examination was based were made by ex-Inspector Littlechild, who lately retired from Scotland Yard after long and distinguished service in the Metropolitan Detective Service. Reported letter of explanation from Wilde. The Evening News, London, states that it has received the following letter from Wilde written on the note paper of the Holborn Viaduct Hotel. To the editor, it would have been impossible for me to have proved my case without putting Lord Alfred Douglas on the witness box against his father. Lord Alfred Douglas was extremely anxious to go into the box, but I would not let him do so. Rather than put him in so painful a position, I determined to retire from the case and to bear on my own shoulders whatever ignominy and shame might result from my prosecuting Lord Queensberry. Oscar Wilde. The Chameleon. It is stated on behalf of Messrs. Gay and Bird, the publishers of the first and only number of this publication, that of their own act they stopped the sale directly they were aware of the contents of the magazine. Such sale was not stopped at the request of a contributor or by anyone else. They were requested to renew the sale and refused.
Are you still here? Awesome! Hit like and subscribe before you check out the In Queer News playlist and other news articles that I've read.